Korea, 1907. A city on fire, not with flame, but with something the Japanese colonial authorities had no category for and no weapon against. Inside a small Presbyterian church in Pyongyang, a revival had broken out 3 weeks earlier that no one planned and no one could stop. Men were confessing sins publicly, weeping without shame, falling to their knees before they reached the altar. The missionaries who witnessed it wrote home to America, saying they had no language for what they were seeing. One of them, a quiet man named William Blair, who had spent 15 years in Korea without seeing results like this, sat in the back of the church on the third night and wept so hard his shoulders shook. He was not weeping from sadness. He did not know what he was weeping from. Into this city, in this year, at this precise moment in history, a 17-year-old boy arrived from the countryside. His name was Choi Jae-hyun. He had walked 2 days to get there, his shoes worn through at the heels, carrying nothing but a letter of introduction from a village elder who had heard the missionaries needed someone who could translate. Jae-hyun spoke 3 languages, Korean, some Japanese, and enough English to stumble through a conversation. He was not a Christian. He was not anything yet. He was a boy who was good with words and needed work, and had heard that Pyongyang was where things were happening. He was right. He had no idea how right. The first night he slept on the floor of the mission compound, listening to sounds he had never heard before. Not music exactly, not crying exactly. Something between the two, coming from the direction of the church, rising and falling like wind through a valley. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and felt something he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe. Not peace, not fear. More like the sensation of standing at the edge of something very large, looking down, realizing the drop is much farther than you thought. He did not go into the church that night. He almost did not go the second night either. But a woman who cooked for the mission compound, a small woman in her 50s with calloused hands and an iron stillness about her, touched his arm as he stood in the doorway and said simply, "You should go in. You came all this way." She was not talking about the 2-day walk from his village. He went in. What happened to Jae-hyun in that church in Pyongyang in the winter of 1907 is the kind of thing that is easy to dismiss if you have never experienced it, and impossible to explain if you have. He did not have a vision. He did not hear an audible voice. He sat in the back row on a wooden bench with his arms crossed and watched men he had never met confess things that were none of his business, and something inside him, something he had kept locked and organized and under control since childhood, simply broke. Not gradually, not politely. Broke the way ice breaks in spring, the way ground breaks before rain comes through it. He wept for 3 hours. He could not have told you afterward what he was weeping about. The loneliness of being the oldest son in a family with no money. The shame of things he had done that no one knew about. The specific grief of being intelligent in a world that had no use for him. All of it came out at once. And when it was over, he sat on the bench in a church, in a city he had arrived in 2 days ago. And something in the room felt different. Or he felt different. He was not sure which. He stayed. That was the decision that changed everything. Not a dramatic decision. Not a decision made in a moment of clarity or conviction. He just did not leave. The mission needed a translator. He was a translator, and something in that church had gotten hold of him, and he did not yet know what to do about it, except stay close to the source of it. The missionaries he worked with noticed him immediately, not because he was loud, because he was quiet in a particular way. The way a person is quiet when they are absorbing everything and saying nothing until they understand it completely. He would sit in the corner during the missionaries' prayer meetings, translating, when asked, silent the rest of the time. And the older men began to suspect they were dealing with someone unusual. One of them, a doctor named Samuel Moffat, who had been in Korea since 1890 and had the kind of stubborn, rooted faith that comes from watching a church grow from nothing, took Jae-hyun aside one afternoon and said something that the young man never forgot. "You have a gift for making words land. Most people speak so others can hear them. You speak so others can feel what you mean. That is a different thing entirely, and it is rarer than you know." Jae-hyun did not know what to do with that. He thanked the doctor and went back to his work. But the words landed. He began to read. Not just the Bible the missionaries gave him, though he read that too, in 3 languages simultaneously: comparing translations the way a jeweler compares stones. He read everything the mission library had. He read the early church fathers. He read Luther. He read John Wesley. He read Chinese and Japanese theological commentaries that most of the Western missionaries could not access. He had an unusual mind, not the kind that collects information, but the kind that synthesizes it, finds the connective tissue between things, sees the pattern underneath the pattern. And he began to pray. This is the part of his story that is hardest to explain, and the part that became most significant. His prayer life was not dramatic in its exterior form. He did not pray loudly. He did not pray at length in public. But those who prayed near him in private noticed something that they mentioned again and again in letters and journals. Being in the room while Jae-hyun prayed felt like standing near an open fire, not threatening, warming, the kind of warmth that makes you realize how cold you have been. He once described his method in a letter to a friend. I do not speak at God. I wait until I know he is listening, and then I say only what I would say if I could see his face. Which means I say very little. But what is said reaches. By 1910, he was 20 years old and the Japanese annexation had come, and everything changed. The Japan that swallowed Korea that year was not interested in Korean Christians, except as a problem to be managed. A colonized people with access to a foreign god and a network of foreign missionaries was a people with loyalties that could not be fully controlled. The authorities did not outlaw Christianity immediately. They were subtler than that. They required churches to participate in Shinto shrine ceremonies. They insisted that prayer meetings be registered. They placed informants in congregations. They applied pressure the way water applies pressure, slowly from every direction, until the container either holds or shatters. Jae-hyun did not shatter, but he was afraid. Let that be said plainly, because his story loses something if it loses this. He was afraid in the specific, exhausting way that intelligent people are afraid. He could see exactly what was coming. He could trace the logic of the threat clearly, and he could not unknow what he knew. In 1911, the Japanese authorities arrested over 100 Korean Christian leaders in what became known as the conspiracy case, accusing them of plotting against the colonial government. Most of the accused were tortured. Many confessed to things they had not done. Some died. Jae-hyun was not arrested in 1911, but he knew 3 of the men who were. He visited one of them after his release, a pastor named Hong, 15 years older than Jae-hyun, with a broken hand that had not healed correctly, and what he saw in that man's face was not defeat. Hong sat in his small room and spoke with a quietness that had nothing diminished about it. He said, "They took everything they could take, and then they discovered that what remained could not be taken. That discovery was more terrifying to them than anything I could have said in court." Jae-hyun went home and did not sleep that night. He was not deciding whether to be brave. He was deciding what he was willing to lose. That is a different question. Bravery is a feeling. Willingness is a choice made before the feeling comes. The 1919 March 1st movement came like a wave that had been building underwater for years. On March 1st of that year, 33 Korean leaders signed a Declaration of Independence and read it publicly in Seoul, knowing exactly what would follow. The Japanese response was immediate and brutal. Peaceful demonstrators were killed in the streets. Villages were burned. Churches were set on fire with people inside them. Jae-hyun was in Pyongyang when the declaration was read. He was 29 years old. He stood in the street with thousands of others and heard the words, and something cracked open in his chest. Not grief, or not only grief, but a fury so clean and so clear it felt almost like a spiritual experience. This was his country. These were his people. And the men who had signed that declaration had not signed it because they thought they would win. They had signed it because some things are worth saying regardless of consequence. He began to preach. Not in the streets. Not yet. In the churches that remained open, in the prayer meetings that continued underground, in the homes of believers who gathered in small groups because large groups were too dangerous. He had always been a translator. Now he discovered that what he was translating was something far older than language. The specific human conviction that God is present even when all evidence suggests otherwise, and that presence changes everything. People came from distances to hear him. This is worth pausing on, because it was not a small thing. Travel in colonial Korea was monitored. Gathering was dangerous. And yet families who had never met Jae-hyun would walk hours to sit in a room where he was speaking, and sit in silence while he prayed, and leave hours later saying the same thing in different words. Something had changed in the room. Or they had changed. They were not sure which. A woman named Yoon-ji, who later wrote a memoir of the revival years, described attending one of his meetings in 1921. He did not use large words. He did not perform. He stood in the center of the room and spoke the way a man speaks when he is running out of time and has only the essential things left to say. When he was finished, no one moved for a long time, not from politeness, because moving felt like leaving something behind. He married in 1922, a woman from Wonsan named Park Sun-ai, a schoolteacher, steady and clear-eyed and deeply skeptical of religious emotion for its own sake. She was exactly what he needed. She asked him hard questions and required honest answers, and refused to accept the kind of vague spiritual language that could mean anything and therefore meant nothing. Their marriage was a collaboration that lasted 40 years, and people who knew them said she was the one who kept his feet on the ground while his mind ranged into territory that might otherwise have untethered him. The Japanese pressure increased through the 1930s. The shrine controversy, as it came to be known, divided the Korean church more painfully than any theological dispute ever had. The colonial government required participation in Shinto ceremonies, and the question of whether Christians could comply, whether it was merely civic, as the authorities claimed, or genuinely idolatrous, some churgations apart. Some church leaders yielded, some fled, some refused and paid for the refusal. Jae-hyun refused. He wrote a statement in 1936 that circulated in manuscript among Korean pastors, which argued simply and without rhetoric that a Christian who bows before a Shinto shrine to preserve his freedom to preach the gospel has already lost the thing he was trying to protect. A man who denies Christ in public, in order to speak of Christ in private, has confused efficiency with faithfulness. They are not the same thing, and God is not confused. The statement reached Japanese authorities within weeks. They came for him on a Tuesday morning in February 1937. Not police. Two men in civilian clothes who knocked on his door before his household was awake, who were professionally courteous, who did not shout. Courtesy deployed as a kind of cruelty, the message being that you are not even worth the energy of rage. He was taken to a detention center in Pyongyang. His wife stood in the doorway and watched them walk him down the street, and she did not call after him because she knew it would not help, and she did not want the last thing he heard from her to be fear. She went inside. She made tea. She sat at the table and put her hands flat on the wood and whispered the 23rd Psalm until she could breathe again. Then she began to organize. She had known this was coming. She had been preparing. Jae-hyun was in detention for 8 months. The room they put him in was small enough that he could touch opposite walls simultaneously. There was a single window high on one wall that admitted a strip of light in the afternoon. He had no books. He had no paper for the first 3 weeks. They gave him food twice a day, not enough but not designed to break him physically. What they wanted was simpler. They wanted him to sign a statement affirming shrine participation. They asked him every few days with varying degrees of patience, and he declined every time, with varying degrees of exhaustion but no variation in the answer. He later wrote that the hardest thing in that room was not the cold, or the hunger, or the isolation. It was the silence in his own mind. For years he had moved from prayer to preaching to translation to correspondence to conversation with barely a pause. His mind had always been full of voices. The texts he was comparing, the arguments he was turning over, the faces of people he needed to write to. In that room, the voices stopped. And in the silence, he discovered something that he had been approaching for 20 years without fully arriving at. He had been doing much of it for people. He had loved God, but he had also loved the work of loving God, the translation, the preaching, the effect on the rooms he entered. Some of what he thought was prayer had been performance, performed for an audience of one, but performed nonetheless. The stripping away of all of it, the audience, the effect, the external confirmation that he mattered, left him with something he had no word for. He began to whisper, not prayers exactly, more like conversations with someone in the room he could not see but could no longer doubt. He said things he had never said aloud to anyone, the specific disappointments of his life, the ways he had fallen short of what he imagined for himself, the fear that his refusal was stubbornness dressed up as conviction. He said them plainly, without drama, the way you speak to someone who already knows and is waiting for you to know too. Something happened in that room. The guards noticed it first. They had been assigned to a prisoner who was supposed to become cooperative, and instead, as the weeks passed, he became something they had no training for. Not defiant, not broken, quiet in a way that made them uncomfortable, the way a deep lake is uncomfortable when you are used to standing water. One of the guards, a young Japanese man named Tanaka, began stopping by Jae-hyun's door in the evenings for reasons he could not explain to his superiors. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they only sat in silence on opposite sides of the door. Tanaka was transferred to another post 6 weeks before Jae-hyun was released. Before he left, he slipped a note under the door that said, "I do not understand your God, but I have seen something in you that I have not seen elsewhere. I want to find it." Jae-hyun kept that note for the rest of his life. He was released in October 1937 and walked out of the detention center into autumn sunlight, thinner by 15 pounds, steadier than he had been in years. Sune was waiting at the gate. She had known the day before he would be released. A sympathetic official had told her, and she had cooked the meal he liked most, and she did not cry when she saw him, and he did not cry when he saw her, and they walked home together without speaking, because after 8 months, there was too much to say, and none of it needed to be said immediately. The church came to him over the following days. Not ceremonially. People simply appeared at the house, 1 or 2 at a time, sitting at the table, drinking tea, not asking much. A man who had been through something like that and come back with his mind intact and his spirit visibly altered was a particular kind of resource in a community under pressure. He was evidence that it was possible, that the thing they were afraid of could be survived, and that surviving it could leave you more, not less. He resumed preaching in 1938 under restrictions that required him to submit sermon outlines for review. He submitted them. The outlines were accurate. What happened in the room during the sermon was something the outline did not capture and could not capture, because it happened between the words, in the pauses, in the moments when he stopped speaking and let the silence work. The years of the Pacific War were years of pressure applied without pause. Several of his closest colleagues yielded on shrine participation. He did not condemn them publicly. He said privately, to Sune, that he understood what they had been carrying and that the same pressure had been applied to him, and he was under no illusion that his refusal had been entirely about conviction and not at all about temperament. "I am also stubborn," he said. God used what was available. Liberation came on August 15, 1945. Korea woke up that morning and discovered that the war was over, and the colonial period was over, and 35 years of occupation had ended. The shock of it was so large that people did not know how to hold it. There was joy. There was grief for everyone who had not survived to see it. There was the particular complicated feeling of people who had spent decades learning to live inside a cage, discovering that the door had been opened and they were not sure, immediately, how to walk out. Jae-hyun walked into the street and stood in the crowd and wept in a way that was different from the weeping in the church in 1907. That weeping had been private, interior, a door opening inward. This weeping was something he shared with 8,000 people on the same street, all of them feeling the same thing at the same time, and the collective weight of it was something he could feel physically, as if history itself had a texture and he was standing inside it. He went home and thanked God for 45 minutes without stopping. The years that followed were not simple. Korea divided, the war came. The country split in a way that felt like a wound that might never close. Jae-hyun's work in the north was cut off by the division of the peninsula. He could not go back to Pyongyang. He rebuilt in Seoul, older now, his hair gone gray, but with an authority that came from a completely different source than it had at 20. Then, it had come from intelligence and gift. Now it came from what the gift had been through. His preaching in the 1950s and 1960s was not the preaching of a young man with something to prove. It was the preaching of someone who had sat in a detention room for 8 months and found God in the silence, who had watched his country dismembered and reassembled, who had outlived several theological convictions he had once been certain of, and discovered that what remained after the certainties fell away was something sturdier than certainty. Young pastors came to sit with him the way they had once come to sit with the missionaries. He was patient with them, mostly. He was not patient with religious performance. One afternoon, a young seminary student gave a long, stylistically interpreted prayer in his presence, and Jae-hyun waited until the student had finished and then said quietly, "That was beautiful. Who were you talking to?" The student did not forget it. In 1971, he sat at his desk to write what would become his final major work. A short, dense, difficult book on prayer that drew from 30 years of private notes and correspondence. His hands had developed a tremor by then, and soon he sat with him in the mornings while he dictated, and in the afternoons he corrected what she had written in his handwriting that had become slower but was still precise. The book argued one thing essentially: that prayer is not a technique for obtaining things from God, and is not an emotional experience of closeness to God, and is not a discipline for improving the self, but is the simple, constant, interior act of a creature turning toward its Creator. Not because it produces results, but because it is what the creature is for. We are made with a direction, he wrote, the way a compass is made with a direction. When we are not turned toward God, we are not broken. We are simply not yet oriented. The prayer is the turning. The turning is enough. The book was not a bestseller. It sold slowly, modestly, in small Christian bookshops in Seoul, and then through a Korean-American network in California, and then through a translation completed by a professor in Germany who had read it and found it essential, into European theological circles, where it was read with the kind of attention usually reserved for much older texts. Jae-hyun never knew how far it traveled. He died on the morning of April 3, 1979, in Seoul, in his own bed, with Sunai beside him. He had been in poor health for 2 years and had spent those years doing what he had always done, reading, writing, praying, and receiving visitors, though fewer now, and his voice lower, and his silences longer. Sunai said he had been talking quietly the night before, not to her, to someone she could not see, in a tone she had heard before when he prayed, that tone of someone speaking to a person who is in the room. In the morning he did not wake. He was 89 years old. He left behind a wife who outlived him by 14 years, 3 children who all went into various forms of ministry, several hundred letters that have never been fully catalogued, and that small book on prayer which is still in print. It is still in print because it is still true. Because the thing he found in the detention room in 1937, the thing Tanaka the guard could not name but saw, is not a thing that belongs to one century or one country or one set of circumstances. It is the thing that Madame Guyon found in the Bastille, and Paul found in the Philippian jail, and Joseph found in the pit. And every prisoner who ever became more free inside than their captors were outside, found in the particular silence that suffering carves out when it has taken everything else. The compass turns. The prayer is the turning. Whatever cell you are standing in right now, and we are all standing in something, the door they locked was not the last door. And the silence on the other side of your noise is not empty. It never was.